Action.
Hi, kindergarten! It's Mrs. Nadelberg and
Jacob.
here to read you a really silly story called
Mr. Bump.
Mr. Bump. Jacob loves these Mr. Men books, and we wanted to share another one with you because it's a funny Friday, right?
Yep.
And the funny thing about this book is that this morning, when Jacob was running around the house in his socks, what did you get?
A bump.
Jacob got a bump on his knee. So this is the perfect book to read today, to remind us all to be careful at home and don't run around the house with your socks on.
Yep.
All right, I'm going to hold the pages, and Jacob is going to read you the words. Here we go.
This is the sad story of Mr. Bump. The trouble is that Mr. Bump could just not help having little accidents. If there was something for Mr. Bump to bump into, he'd bump right into it all right. For instance, if you were to see Mr. Bump walking down a street in your town, and if there happened to be something to bump into down that street, then you know what would happen, don't you?
Yeah, he's going to bump into it, right? Let's see. Oh, read that one.
Bump.
Bump. Aww.
Mr. Bump was just the same at home. He lived in an extremely nice home, but even there, he couldn't help having those little accidents. For instance, one morning when Mr. Bump went outside his house, he noticed that the chimney pot had come loose in the storm the night before. "I must fix it before it falls off," said Mr. Bump to himself, and he hurried to his garden shed to fetch a ladder. It was a very long ladder.
Do you think it's a good idea for Mr. Bump to be climbing a ladder? I don't know.
Mr. Bump walked up to the garden path with the ladder on his shoulder. He turned the corner of the garden path. Crash! Went the living room window. "Oh dear," thought Mr. Bump, and he turned to see what had happened. Crash! Went the kitchen window behind him. "Oh dear," said Mr. Bump again, and he rested the ladder against the wall of the house so that he could climb up onto the roof to fix the chimney. Crash! Went the bedroom window.
Uh-oh.
So you can see how Mr. Bump had his little accents. Mr. Bump had many jobs, but somehow they never seemed to last very long. As soon as anything got lost or broken or splintered or chipped or snapped or cracked or torn or burst or wrenched or crunched or split or slit, Mr. Bump got the blame.
Oh, poor Mr. Bump. Getting
For
blamed for everything.
instance, when Mr. Bump worked on a farm, he tripped over the farm dog and spilled the milk, which he was carrying for the farmer's wife, and which the farm cat lapped up.
That means to drink up, to lap up.
For instance, when Mr. Bump was a bus driver, he fell off the bus and couldn't catch up with it again, and all the passengers traveled without having to pay. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a carpenter, he found out when he was hammering nails, he hammered his thumb most of the time and the nail hardly at all.
Ouch.
In order to recover from the series of rather unfortunate happenings, Mr. Bump decided to take a vacation. There he could think about what sort of job he could do, where he wouldn't be such a nuisance to everybody. So he set off to the station to catch a train to the beach.
Oh, he's tired of being such a bother, so he's going to go away somewhere.
While Mr. Bump was on vacation, several things happened. For instance, he fell off a boat into the sea, and a lifeboat had to come and rescue him. For instance, one day when he was quietly walking along the beach, minding his own business, he got his foot stuck in a bucket. And as soon as he couldn't get it off, he had to walk around with it on his foot for hours.
Oh.
For instance, another time when he was walking along the beach, He walked straight into a large hole that somebody had dug, and he had to stay there all night because he couldn't climb out on his own. However, despite all these little accidents, Mr. Bump enjoyed his vacation, and while he was there, he had a splendid idea about what sort of job he should do. It was quite the best idea Mr. Bump ever had, an absolutely splendid idea.
What do you think would be a good job for Mr. Bump? He couldn't hurt himself. Let's see.
And now Mr. Bump works happily for Mr. Barley, the farmer.
Oh.
Mr. Barley has a rather large apple orchard on his farm, and that's where Mr. Bump works.
What does he do there?
Mr. Bump's job is picking apples, but he doesn't use a ladder to climb up the tree to pick apples like other apple pickers. Oh no, Mr. Bump has a much better way of picking apples than that. He just walks around, and before long, Mr. Bump, being Mr. Bump, walks into a tree. Bump!
Bump. What happens when he bumps into the trees?
And down falls an apple, and Mr. Bump catches it. And this makes the job of apple picking much easier. And Mr. Bump is very pleased about his new job, and Mr. Barley is very pleased about his new apple picker. So you see, the story of Mr. Bump isn't such a sad story after all. And if you ever bump yourself, you know what to do, don't you?
Oh, what should we do?
I don't know. Go and pick an apple picked by Mr. Bump, and then you won't feel your bump at all. You'll remember that the next time you have a bump, won't you? Good. The end.
This is Mrs. Nadelberg and Jacob telling you to have a wonderful day and be careful. Don't bump yourself. Bye.